Good afternoon everyone, I'm Sue Gilchrist, I'm the Regional Managing Partner of Herbert Freehills for Asia and Australia. And I'd like to begin today's event by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we're gathered today, the Gadigal of the Eora Nation, and to pay my respects and yours to their elders past and present. I'm really delighted to welcome you all to this very special event. I get the pleasure of welcoming you, but the people who've done all the hard work and applied all the skill, including selecting a fabulous speaker, for today is actually the HSF Women's Network. This is a network of people on our Sydney Diversity and Inclusion Committee, and it comprises talented women from our legal and business services team across the firm, and their focus is ensuring that HSF continues to be a place where women thrive in their careers. So thank you to them. So I'd like to give a very warm welcome to our guest, the Honourable Justice Catherine Branson QC. Thank you so much, Cathy, for taking the time to be here with us today. We're absolutely honoured that you would join us for this event. I also want to extend a very warm welcome to each of you, to our clients, to our colleagues from the bar. We're really pleased that you have been able to join, and the reason for the interesting format, which I would refer to as picnic-style lunch, is really just because this was such a popular event. So Cathy's very kindly, I think, actually doing without any lunch. We would have liked to put on one of our usual beautiful lunches, but there are more pressing needs. People need to hear what Cathy has to say. So to call the Honourable Justice Cathy Branson QC a trailblazer is no exaggeration. Just to pick up a few highlights of her career, she was called to the Adelaide Bar very early in her career. She went on to serve as the first female Crown Solicitor in Australia and was the second woman in Australia's history to head a government department. Cathy was appointed as a Queen's Counsel before then serving as a federal court judge between 1994 and 2008. I still remember how pleased many of us were when we heard the news of her appointment at that time. Upon retiring from the court, she became the President of the Australian Human Rights Commission, and in 2009 the Australian Human Rights Commissioner, serving in that role until 2012. There's no doubt that Cathy Branson has not only enjoyed her own brilliant career in the law, but has generously helped forge a path for all women in the legal profession. During her time at the Australian Human Rights Commission, Cathy consistently highlighted the rewards that flow from a truly diverse society, a society that takes advantage of the wealth of backgrounds, views and talents on offer. Given what looks like the result of the election on Saturday, although as we know we don't have a result, the voices of champions of diversity and inclusion, in particular multicultural inclusion, will need to be heard even more than ever and more loudly. Today we're here to focus on one aspect of diversity, gender diversity, something that we at Herbert Freehills are committed to advancing, and I'm personally passionate about continuing to make real progress in this area for all of our people. It's essential to our capability and our performance as a firm. The enthusiastic response from our clients and other invitees to this event tells us that gender diversity is also recognised as critical to you and your organisation, and this is very encouraging. For law firms, and this is a bit of a nudge to our clients, the fact that our clients recognise the importance of gender diversity and inclusion and communicate their expectations to the firm and its partners has a powerful impact within the firm. So please keep up your excellent work in that regard, I'm sure you will. So you know the order of proceedings today. First we'll get to enjoy a speech from Justice Branson, followed by a one-on-one interview by our own Oprah Winfrey, Luke Hastings. Luke is the Regional Practice Group Head for Disputes in Australia, and he's helping us provide some gender diversity today. We'll conclude with an opportunity for your questions, and we will release you at 2 o'clock. We always make that promise, and we hope that our timing works out to fit with that. So now could you please join me in welcoming the Honourable Justice Cathy Branson.
Thank you very much, Sue, and thank you, Herbert Smith Freehills, for this invitation. I'm delighted if I can concentrate on the Freehills part of what I assume to be an amalgamated firm, to be what I understand to be the first major firm in Australia to have a female partner. The second was my friend Claire Gross, also from South Australia as I am, and among the other, I think, relatively early female partners, my close friend Margaret Stone. So it's for that reason that I feel a certain warmth about being in what I have to say, out of old habits, tend to think of as Freehills. And I'm delighted to be asked to speak about equality or justice for women, and particularly women in the law. It's an issue that's been close to my heart and which I fear I've been speaking about now for an exceptionally long time. And there are three key themes that I want to just touch on in this address today. The first is that equality and justice are not one and the same. And often in fighting diversity battles, all diversity battles, but we've seen it certainly in the fight for justice for women, we struggle to get equality, and as at least most lawyers know, if you treat people whose circumstances are not the same in the same way, that is equally, you'll not get a fair outcome for both sides. So we need to remember that equality and justice are not the same. And we also have to understand that what seems a fair thing, what seems just, will vary over time. So what will be just for young women starting in the law now will be something quite different than what was thought to be justice for someone like me, and certainly from someone even of the few around, those even older than me. And that leads to the point that things are changing very quickly everywhere, and things are changing very quickly in the way that the law is practiced as well. And so we have to keep alert to that as we search out for what's the fair thing for the time in which we are. Because as things change, we'll have to look differently to find out what's fair and just at that time. So it's 50 years since I studied law. That startles me, but it's 50 years this year since I entered the Adelaide Law School. My experience, I think, will be very different from those of you who entered law school a good deal later than that. 10 out of 110 students in my year were female. I suspect less than 10 female practitioners in the firms, or indeed practicing law in any way. The job section in the local paper is still published in two sections, men and boys, and women and girls. If I was looking for a job as a graduate, I would have had to look in the men and boys section and then talk someone into allowing me to apply for the position. And things hadn't changed a lot when I left the law school. I stayed on and taught for 2 years on the academic staff of the Adelaide Law School, and then I went into articles of clerkship, which I hadn't done earlier. I was finishing an arts degree when most of my colleagues went into articles. I remember very distinctly going with my partner off to one of Adelaide's oldest law firms, and in the course of his introduction to the most senior partner in that very old law firm, it sort of came out that I was an articled law clerk and I wasn't a secretary. And just without thinking, this older man just expostulated when he learned not only did I have one law degree, but I had 2 university degrees, just expostulated, my God, someone's wasted a lot of money on your education. It was the kind of thing that people felt free to say in those days. It was, of course, before South Australia's Sex Discrimination Act, and South Australia had the first of all of the Sex Discrimination Acts in Australia. It wasn't enacted until 1975. And when we look back at it, as I've done often, as I'm sure many people here have, we see how modest were the ambitions that fed the Sex Discrimination Act. The sort of thing, I think, was well illustrated in the case of Deborah Wardley. Does anyone here remember Deborah Wardley? Not many, but I was privileged to appear as junior counsel in the case of Deborah Wardley. Deborah Wardley was Victorian. She was a flight instructor. She taught flying in the commercial aviation industry. And she decided she'd like to fly for Ansett. And she applied for 2 years and wasn't recruited, and then began to be suspicious why she wasn't being recruited, since she was one of the few applicants that actually knew how to fly. And then Ansett made it plain she wasn't being recruited because Ansett didn't have planes flown by women. So she went off to Victorian Equal Opportunities Board to complain about that, and eventually ended up in the High Court. And the case that Ansett ran was, it might be all right for women to fly small planes. Women didn't fly passenger planes because their menstrual cycles made them psychologically unsuitable to fly passenger planes. Now, the case went to the High Court not on that point, as you might imagine, but on some point about intersection of Commonwealth and state law. But Deborah Wardley went on to fly for Ansett, and with considerable success. And what Deborah was fighting for was what all of us in that time, the mid-70s into early 80s, were fighting for. We wanted to be treated the same way as men were treated. You know, if men could fly planes, we wanted to fly planes. If men could be partners in law firms, we couldn't see why we couldn't be partners in law firms. But after a while, when all those battles were won, all the laws that said women can't do this were gone. The laws that said you can't discriminate because someone was gone. We looked around the profession, and what did we find? It hadn't changed all that much. And so that's when people began to really appreciate that formal equality is a step forward from not having it, but doesn't actually take you all that far. In fact, it assisted women who were principally, like me, women who had no children and no caring responsibilities. And that was dramatically illustrated when I was preparing for a speech right back in 2002. I was sitting on the Federal Court in Sydney, and I wanted to compare the home circumstances of men and women. Well, of course, I had 15 male colleagues on the Federal Court. It was no problem getting a sample of men. It wasn't all that easy getting a sample of women. So I used all of the women then on the Federal Court and all of the women on the New South Wales Supreme Court. Even then, I only got to 10 women to compare with 15 men. But what I discovered, that of the women, there were 10, only 4 of them were married, only 3 of them had children, only 2 of those women had practiced at the bar. Both of them had done so with full-time paid domestic help. Of the 15 male colleagues, all but one was married. The one who wasn't was living in a marriage-like relationship and had previously been married. All but 2 had children, and of the 13 with children, not one of them had paid domestic help to look after their children. Presumably because that's where their wives were, looking after the children and running the household. So that really illustrated who got the benefit from the simple rule, treat women like men and don't disadvantage them just because they're women. Most women who want to have a traditional family life, as most men want to have, found that they were seriously handicapped. And things haven't changed all that much. We still have a significant pay gap across the board, up to nearly 25% if you take total remuneration into account, nearer about 18% if you only take ordinary full-time pay but not total pay into account. We know as you go up the corporate world, women drop off rapidly as you get to the senior leadership positions. We know that 60% of law graduates are women, but only 28% of our judges are women. More than half of all our law academics are women, but less than a third of them are found in the positions senior to a senior lecturer. So this is after we've got rid of formal barriers, brought in discrimination legislation, and started to move to the more difficult things. You know, we now have subsidised childcare, we now have maternity leave, we're starting to address domestic violence as an impediment to ongoing work, and we still don't have the outcomes that we would really think were desirable, not only for women, but for society. You know, if half the nation's talent is in the brains of women, you want them out. If half the nation's caring capacity is in your men, you want them involved in the domestic environment as well. So what's to be done? We have to, of course, remember that the fight for justice is not the fight for equality, as I've said. So we need things. It's hard to know what they are. I suspect women of the age represented here will have a better idea than I would have about what would help them. But it might well be things like support through maternity leave, to stay in touch with your employer, whether it's your firm or some other employer, in a firm, having perhaps your clients protected and preserved for you for your return and not farmed out amongst your male colleagues while you're away. Might be some way to keep your superannuation balances up while you're out of the workforce, so women are not disproportionately in impecunious circumstances when they leave the paid workforce. There'll be a whole range of things, but we need to start identifying it fairly rapidly what these things are. And part of the importance of watching for change in your society, I think, is not just seeing that women now have a legitimate demand to do in the public space what men do in the public space, but to see that men in increasing numbers are wanting to do in the private space what women have long done in the private space. So we see more and more men wanting to be seriously involved in the raising of their children, wanting to be around their sick and elderly parents as they age. And we see that they have the capacity to do these things. We need to stop seeing women, indeed I think this probably has happened, but when I was a young practitioner, women were plainly the outsiders in the law. So people could make offensive remarks to you about your desire to be a practicing lawyer. People said things to me like, why ever would you want to do this? Men don't like women like you. I wouldn't marry a woman like you. I wouldn't let my daughter do what you're doing. And these things, I think, are gone. But whether we've wholly lost the implicit assumption that women are really outsiders and the law is a male place and women ought to adjust their behaviours and expectations to fit into it, I'm less confident. I'm less confident about that. But we're plainly on the right path. The danger of that is, of course, you don't make adjustments for outsiders. That's why an inclusive society is so important. If someone is genuinely an outsider, it's their job to fit in with you. If they're really part of you, then you'll find ways to make them comfortable as part of you. Part of this problem, I think, is the Australian mythology. My husband, who practiced for a very long time as a gynaecologist, and partly as an obstetrician, says you need to understand that a very high proportion of Australian men actually don't like women. Now, I fear there is something in what he says, although he might be putting it too highly. But when you think about the Australian mythology, the Australian story, it is about white, probably Protestant, men battling the elements, doing rugged and tough stuff, founding a new country, pushing back frontiers. It doesn't have a lot to do with the softer, more feminine side of our history. I think feminism has really helped with that. I mean, I was thrilled, pathetically thrilled really, to find that in the centenary year of Anzac, the biggest television program was Anzac Girls. I mean, that told me we had come a really long way, and it was an important step towards addressing this notion about what it is to truly be Australian and addressing the Australian mythology, which is so slanted towards powerful white men. But it's something we have to watch. And so, one of the changes I've mentioned is you see men willing, able and perfectly competent to handle family responsibilities and care for people of any age. And the importance of this reminded me of a story that some of you will have heard me tell, but I'll tell it again because it's a fun little story. When I was first married, I have to intersperse for the first time, so I wasn't very old. A girlfriend of mine and I married at about the same time. 4 of us, 2 households, not very much money. And we were having a little casual meal one night, probably spaghetti or something, chatting about how we were going to get these 2 new households working since we didn't have much money. So we agreed, each of us agreed, each household agreed, that a capital expense we could avoid was buying a washing machine, because there were laundromats all about. So we reached an understanding, each with our respective partner. For 6 months, the girls would meet on Saturday morning, have a cup of coffee and put the family laundry through the laundromat. Second 6 months, the men would do the same. Now, what happened, of course, is obvious to most of you. For 6 months, my girlfriend and I met every Saturday morning for a coffee and we put the laundry through the laundromat. 6 months and 1 week later, both households had washing machines. And I tell this story for this reason. Priorities change. Outcomes change. When what is seen as women's problems become men's problems. And it doesn't just happen in poor households. It is across the board. And that is why I'm completely persuaded, if we're going to have real equality in the workforce, real equality in the law for women, we have to get men to argue that they are entitled to have time to spend with their children. They are entitled to take time to care for their elderly family. They are entitled to do it without compromising their careers. They are entitled to do it without losing their financial security. If women are to have equality, justice in the workplace, we'll get it if men fight for it and fight for the same thing as us. As it's now recognised to be preposterous that women can't fly planes because they have periods, it's equally preposterous today to argue that men are better suited, that women are better suited than men at caring. We know it's not true. They might do it differently, they do it just as well. So equality for everyone really means here everyone sharing the same responsibilities at work, but also, most critically, at home. Fairness, equality in the workplace means fairness and equality at home. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Cathy. And Cathy has given me permission to call her Cathy, for those in the room who are nervous about, as I was, as well as channeling Oprah, nervous about addressing Cathy as Cathy. I was fortunate enough to be in the audience at the Law and Justice Awards last October when I heard Cathy first speak about some of these topics that I first heard. These topics, of course, as Cathy mentioned, she's been making these observations quite plain to those who would listen for more than a decade. And I came away from that evening quite uncomfortable, quite confronted, and indeed hearing even the washing machine story again today, feeling quite uncomfortable and confronted. They're very compelling propositions that Cathy has put forward. And I found it very concerning that many of the events that Cathy's identified have occurred within my lifetime, indeed many of our lifetimes. These are not issues that go back into prehistory. They're issues which have occurred quite recently. If only there were as much disruption in this part of our community as there is in technology. But the goal for today is to ask Cathy some questions. Cathy will share some of her perspectives on these matters. But then I'm going to open up the opportunity to each of you to ask questions. So if you want to have a think about those questions while I go first, please do. So Cathy, it's very hard to strive for something that you can't see already around you. And you mentioned that when you were studying in Adelaide, at that stage, the number of female legal practitioners hadn't even reached double digits. Given that, did you always imagine for yourself the role as a judge?
Look, I certainly didn't. In fact, it was really only a couple of days before someone invited me to consider being a judge that I thought about that as a real possibility. But to make it plain, I didn't study law intending even to be a practicing lawyer. So in a sense, my career all happened a bit by accident around me. But we did have some interesting dichotomy, and I think it probably applied right around Australia and probably elsewhere. There were, most of you will remember Dame Roma Mitchell, I think, the late Dame Roma Mitchell. The higher proportion of her year of law was female than my year, and she was studying in the 30s. And I think we tend to forget that it was post-Second World War where there was this real social pressure to get women out of the workplace. Women had come into the factories, into the munitions, they were keeping the farms going while the men were at the front. And then when the soldiers came home, it was thought to be critical in the public interest to get the women out. So women were all encouraged to have laundry that was whiter than white and cleaners with hoovers in the houses being cleaned by hoovers and all of that. So the numbers dropped, and it just really starting to build up in about the year that I went to law school, I think, when we became 10%. So what we did have was a small number of senior women. Dame Roma was appointed to the Supreme Court at about the time I started studying law. And the other interesting thing is that a woman called Dorothy Somerville was still practicing. Admittedly, she was in her 80s, but she was the one of the women who had a law degree but had to wait for the Legal Practitioners' Removal of Female Prohibition Act to be passed to be allowed to practice at all. So as Luke says, change has come fairly rapidly, that I practiced with a woman at the same time as a woman who was one of the first legal practitioners, female legal practitioners in Australia. But no, there were very few role models, but I wasn't thinking of being a practitioner anyway.
Have there been particular females or males, for that matter, who provided role modelling to you in each of those stages of your career?
Look, I think, as you would expect, a range of things. I grew up in the country on a rural property. Sheep were bred and grains were grown. And my father had a strong aversion to useless women. So I had two brothers but no sisters. But if my brothers were learning to drive the tractor, I learned to drive the tractor. You know, if trucks were being driven, I was taught to drive the truck. If sheep were being rounded up, I was expected to have the same capacity to do that. And at the time, it didn't occur to me that it was influencing me, but it did ultimately leave me thinking, well, if a boy can do it, I can do it. Because that was the expectation. Then he was no feminist, and I don't think he expected me to go into paid work. But nonetheless, he was very influential about that. My career really changed when I did two things. I left private practice as a fairly inexperienced practitioner, joined the government's law office, and for the first time worked where the expectations of women and men seemed to be the same. I initially took a job for which I was overqualified, and that actually proved to be a boon because I looked very good, and probably anyone with my experience who took that rather junior job would have looked as good. But if you get a reputation for being good, you know, it sticks with you. It was very handy. I did very good work, both as a research officer to the Solicitor General and then as an employed solicitor within the Crown Solicitor's office. But my career really took off when South Australia's then Attorney General, was Christopher Sumner, I'm happy to say, appointed me as Crown Solicitor and head of the Attorney General's Department just before I turned 36. Now, that was a real watershed moment for him and for me. We were either going to crash together, or it was going to work. And it was seen to work, and I think I owe Chris a great debt for that.
We focus here quite a bit on sponsorship. The mentoring is obviously very, very important, but identifying more senior or experienced practitioners who can positively advocate for the lawyers that they're working with, particularly the female lawyers. Is that something that you've experienced or you've observed as a positive element of your own career or careers that you've seen flourish around you?
Look, I think it is an important thing. Looking back on my life, and of course I'm anxious to say it's almost time immemorial since I was in a law firm, but the men in my experience then automatically picked up informal sponsorships within the firm. They were often there because of some connection with one of the senior members of the firm who were all male. The women didn't experience that. And there was no challenge to a culture that assumed that women would not go on to partnership. I think that government law officers have really led the way in establishing cultures in which the same thing is expected of the women as of the men, and the same opportunities are there for the women as for the men. The Solicitor General, for whom I worked, who later became Justice Brian Cox of the Supreme Court, and the Crown Solicitor later became Justice Graham Pryor of the Supreme Court, both were very supportive of my career, and I think I probably owe them a lot. And I think I should add, for those who are not aware, in the South Australian government law offices, counsel are in-house. That's why I can name so many former people who held office within South Australia's government law offices that went on to courts. It's because they were doing high-level advocacy. And when I was Crown Solicitor, I appeared regularly in the Supreme Court, less regularly, but I appeared a good number of times in the High Court. And that's what lawyers in that office, could do.
You mentioned the very large discrepancy between the number of women who are coming through university, graduating with legal degrees, and obviously the number of women who are in top leadership positions, whether at law firms like this one, at the bar and the judiciary. What do you see as the greatest barriers to women attaining those top leadership positions? I appreciate that's a large question and you touched on some of that in your speech.
It's a context question, and I think there are a lot of things that come together to achieve that outcome. Some of them are negative things, they're not all negative things. I mean, one thing we know, for example, is that women invest less in their public persona. They're less tied up in the notion of what job they hold than men are. Of course it's not uniform, but across the board, women are less tied up in importance of position. And they're described in some workplaces as the workplace canary. The analogy being with the canaries that went down into the coal mines, if anyone remembers when canaries went into the coal mines. They were taken into the coal mines because they snuffed it earlier than people if there was too much toxic gas around. So if a canary died, you got out. And women have often been described as the canaries of large workplaces. If the women start to leave, you've got to start looking at your corporate or your firm culture, because a year or so later your men will start to leave, but the women will leave first. They feel able to leave because being the senior partner of somewhere or being the lead practitioner of some area is not actually as important to them as it will be to a man, and if it gets unpleasant enough, they'll leave when your man might stay. So some of our top jobs are not actually all that attractive. And sometimes women will be sensible enough to say, I'm actually not willing to do that. But they ought to have the choice, and the problem is that they don't always have the choice. Cultures can be subtle, discouraging, and hard to identify and change. Back in my day, the sort of things, I'm sure they don't exist now, but sort of things were partners went to the footy and drank beer with the clients on a Saturday. And all partners kind of went. And the girls kind of didn't fit in. No one went to the opera and had a glass of champagne or a cocktail or a pint of wine. Men did boysy things and women got excluded. Just the general chat could be antagonistic to women. I think there are issues of that kind, but the critical one is that women have too many demands on their time and energy. If, as you would expect, most of them want to partner and have children, if they get no support for the caring of those children, their careers are going to fall apart when compared with their male partner whom they're supporting. And people within partnerships have to decide how that partnership will best work for them. I've now got a number of female friends who are the primary breadwinners for their families, and their partners stay home and care for the children. We need more women and men to feel able to have that discussion and feel that that's a fair solution. Dividing your time equally is a fair solution. Nothing wrong with having the man go to work and the woman stay at home if it's a free choice, if that's what she wants, if they've thought through what that means for them. I suspect women need to be slightly more able to articulate what it is that they want in their life, both personally and professionally.
I think that's a cue for me to note that we sponsor the Australian Ballet, for which we're very proud. Danielle, sitting down the front row here, one of our senior partners, who I recall very well, used to make references to cricket just about each day and find a way to describe our practice by reference to cricket. And at some point in his career that was called. It changed slightly, his practice, but not completely. You mentioned, Cathy, that at times you've been judged harshly for the career choices that you've made, and by both men and women. I imagine that would feel very cruel to be the subject of those observations. Is that something that you've seen change over your career, or are you still perceiving that level of antagonism?
There's a little bit of it. I think it's changed. I mean, it's worth, because we're talking about how rapid change has been. When I already held a relatively senior position in the South Australian Government's law offices, in Queensland, a married woman had to resign from the public service. So, you know, and that rule had been abolished in South Australia some years before I joined the government's employment, but things have changed a lot. Behaviours have dramatically changed. I can't think now of many, if any, men who would openly say to women, you know, what are you doing, what are you being a lawyer, it's no place for you, girlie, you know, I think that sort of stuff's gone. How much improved behaviour is just masking similar thinking, we don't know, but I think thinking is also coming quite a long way. What I see now that worries me in a way even more is women being cruel to women. You know, women are hard on women. Young women are hard on each other. You know, I have nieces, stepdaughters, and they're repressed about whether they're good enough parents. You know, people are saying you either ought not to be working, or you ought to be working, or you ought to be doing this with your children, or you ought to be doing some other thing for your children, you ought to be doing this so far as your partner is concerned. I think women have to free up and be a bit softer on each other. You know, we can't expect men to be a bit more generous towards us if we can't be more generous to each other.
We have been undertaking some unconscious bias training here, and Heather, who's sitting down in the front row, has been leading the charge for that, and we're eternally grateful. And I think picks up, whilst the more extreme observations are not expressed, and indeed I dare say not held, the challenge that at an unconscious level there remain biases that will affect the way in which people will, you know, approach the work that they hand out, and whether it's you know, for example, an administrative task that might be offered to a female in a particular situation for no positively good reason. It could have been done by anybody, but obviously an important area for us to continue to focus on.
She might do it better.
She may do it better. And if that were the reason that we allocated the task, then that's perfectly fine.
Not necessarily.
Well, okay. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I'm not sure where I meant to go from here. We're going to toss open to the audience shortly, and we have a women's network here at Herbert Smith Freehills that has been running workshops on the topics of women and the confidence gap. And I think you might have been getting towards this topic in one of your earlier questions. A number of studies suggest that in the workplace context at least, women are often not as confident in sort of presenting themselves as men. Now, I should immediately say that those studies make it quite clear that the diversity within gender is far more significant than between gender, so I'm not suggesting that this is a sort of an issue that necessarily warrants as much focus as it sometimes gets. But I'm interested in your thoughts around women and confidence, presence, and the like.
Look, what you say about diversity is true, but your main point is also very true and established again and again and again. Men will put themselves forward for positions for which they objectively hold about 25% of what is said to be the essential criteria. Women will put themselves forward only if they've got about 110%. And it's not all women and it's not all men, but that's the pattern if you survey a large number of workplaces. Men just think they can wing it, and they might. So we do need women to have slightly more confidence in themselves and their abilities, and to be willing to put themselves forward, and to remember things like, if someone appoints you, they've got an investment in your doing well. They'll almost certainly be there to help you. People like to be asked for help and support. But it does involve everyone being a little bit thoughtful. I heard one of Australia's big business boys speaking recently, and he spoke, for example, about meeting with all of his senior staff on a quite regular basis, always meeting in working hours, never asking anyone to stay back when they might have domestic responsibilities to attend to, and always asking them what their ambitions were, if their ambitions were a bit underdeveloped or insufficiently challenging, encouraging them to have more substantial aspirations, exploring how he could support them, develop the skills, explaining to them, and this is men and women, explaining to them
how support could be provided for them if they took the step up the ladder. I think these things are very important. The other thing he said, which I thought was interesting, that he found it necessary, I think less necessary perhaps in a legal environment than it once was, which is always asking people at a meeting in turn what they have to contribute, to prevent the loud voice, the loud, nearly always male voice, dominating, and the more timid voice, probably a female voice, not being heard. So there are strategies, but we have to remember that we're all biased. We all have stereotypes in our mind, and we all have to learn to challenge them. I was quite taken to read when a quite prominent feminist wrote recently that she was on a plane, and the voice of the pilot came over, and she beamed because she realised the pilot was female. And then they flew into bad weather, and she caught herself thinking, my God, I hope she can fly. And she realised she would never have thought that for a male pilot, and she went home sort of shamed and diminished, and renewed her efforts to challenge the biases that we all carry.
You mentioned that the only way that gender discrimination is going to change is if it also becomes a man's problem, and I enjoyed for the second time your anecdote about the washing machine purchase. Obviously identifying that only when these issues become personal do they sort of out. Mm-hmm. How do you think we make gender discrimination a man's problem?
Well, look, it's very hard to know. Essentially, you're intruding into the private lives of partners, however they choose to structure their lives. And I think giving people that freedom is important, not being judgmental is important, softening up women against women is important. But ultimately, if a firm like this one or any other firm wants to find out how to help its employees live the sort of life that we've been talking about, you have to ask them what will make the difference. I mean, it's a really quite fundamental human rights principle. If you want to assist anybody, you have to ask them what it is that will help them, and you might be surprised by the answers. Sometimes we think we know what the answer is, and it turns out not to be the thing at all. That there's some other thing that's quite critical, but no one ever thought to ask, even though it could have been addressed if it had been articulated. So I think you just have to communicate.
You have as one of your themes, obviously, today, the difference between equality and justice, and I've heard you talk about society's acceptance of the fact that in a number of areas, the poor, disabled, veterans and the like, that's recognised immediately that a just result will not be achieved by affording equality amongst those people and the rest of society. Here at Freehills and at obviously many firms like ours, we have flexible work and seek to encourage both males and females who have responsibilities outside of the work environment to be able to modify their working environment so that they can basically achieve both the various responsibilities that they have here as well as those outside of the work. Are there other things that you think businesses could and should be doing to recognise the commitments that people have outside of the work environment?
Look, again, it's very hard to say precisely what should be done. I think you have to speak to the people affected and find out what's critical for them. But my expectation is that law practice is going to look very different in 10 and 20 years from now. We've seen change already, but I suspect much greater change is on the way. I mean, people are speculating that very few big law firms are likely to survive in their present format. I suspect we'll be even more online, even more connected in the future than we are now. I suspect flexible work, work from home, hot desking, all of these things will come in. They all actually bring great potential for greater equality in the workplace. If you can work 24 hours a day, not desirable that you do, but if you can choose what part of the 24 hours you're going to work in, you can adjust it around other demands on your life. I think that will help. But as society begins to experience, as part of normal experience, that women will do a wider variety of things, and as they experience men doing a wider variety of things and doing it proudly and with a sense of legitimacy, things will alter, but the main thing for employers will be to listen and stay in touch and find out what's needed.
If I can just ask one final question, just picking up on your observation there about the future. Let's just imagine we've gone forward 20 years. What do you anticipate, or what would you like to see the greatest change in the legal profession to be to deal with gender equality? What will have happened?
Well, look, I think lots of things will have happened. They won't all, I suppose, affect gender equality, but in a way they might. I mean, I want to say again how long it is since I worked in a law firm. And so what I hear about law firms may not be quite right. It comes from the perspective of someone whose views may not be accepted by others. And even then it's probably fairly old hat because, I left the court in 2008. But I think it would be a very positive thing for men and women, but perhaps especially women, if the life of the most junior lawyers was an easier one. I have always thought that a lawyer who knows nothing of the world will never make a top lawyer. If you don't get out in society, if you don't mix with the diversity of people, if you don't have some understanding about how the sort of people that you're wanting to provide services to live their lives, you won't make a good legal advisor to them. You're locked up in your firm, very long hours, doing relatively menial work, and then just catching up on your sleep when you go home. You're not going to be that sort of person. And whilst, if it's still the case, that the law firms do put enormously heavy burdens of time and billing on young lawyers so that the life is a pretty arduous, oppressive one, your good women are going to leave too early for you to ever to mentor them into senior leadership roles. Some of that might come down to the people at the very top simply wanting more than a fair share of the income. There is a limit to how much money you actually need, even in Sydney. Certainly the sort of the striving for the huge amounts of wealth that you see in some, I don't say it's this one, but in some modern large law firms, simply was no part of legal practice when I was there. As a young practitioner, we thought of ourselves as a service-providing firm, not as a money-making enterprise. I would like the law once again to be a service-providing industry and not a money-making one.
20 years ago, I umpired tennis at the Australian Open, which is very exciting. And I would always be the net judge on centre court, which was a prestigious position for a woman. And the men, including my husband, would be on the service line. And one of my friends, who happened to be a very sort of feminist male at the time, raised with the people who would make these decisions, look, why are women never on the service line? And the person said, well, I said, well, they don't sound like service lines people. Or probably said service lines men. And I wondered, Kathy, whether to your observation, do you think that that sort of perception is perhaps one of the reasons why women tend not to have these top-paying positions at the moment, that there's this ongoing perception?
Look, I think there's something in what you say. Interestingly, professional women are said to have voices appreciably lower in their timbre than women in the general population. So whether we've taught ourselves to speak in a deeper tone or whether there's some other connection, I don't know. But you see it again with height. I happen to know the American figures, I don't know the comparable Australian figures, but a fairly small percentage of American men are taller than 6'2", and a minuscule number taller than 6'4". But an overwhelming number, well over 50% of corporate leaders in America are men over 6'2", and men over 6'4" are absolutely, astronomically overrepresented in leadership positions. So there are things we sort of tend to associate with power and gravitas that tend to be male models. If I may be naughty, we remember, don't we, John Howard saying there was no person in Australia with the gravitas of Archbishop Hollingworth when he appointed him Governor-General. Now, Quentin Bryce was around, and she made a pretty good Governor-General when she was appointed, but John Howard couldn't identify a woman with the gravitas to be Governor General. So these are things we just have to learn to challenge, and the women who challenge them very well, I think, do us a great service.
One of the things that I encounter in dealing with some of the issues that you've been talking about today is a significant portion of women say, please don't do that for me because it will appear as though I've had an easier route than the men might have had. Did you encounter that sort of views amongst your fellow females in the law when you were developing your career? And how can we bring on side those women who might have that view that things are being made easier for them than for others?
Because it's an interesting thing, and it's been a perplexing issue for a lot of women, I think. Many people have asserted that I was appointed Crown Solicitor for South Australia when I was, because I was female. I've discussed it now with Chris Sumner, decades and decades later, and he's confirmed what I believed at the time to be the case, that it wasn't so. He appointed me for some quite distinct reasons, but being female wasn't one of them. And in fact, he was apprehensive of the risk of my being female, because a female who doesn't work out then, and probably even a little bit now, carries a higher risk than a man who doesn't work out. We're kind of accustomed to men not working out. well, only because they've always been there, and some of them work and some of them don't. That's how life is. But if you haven't seen many women there and one doesn't work out, you're inclined to think some women can't do this. But I've got no doubt I was appointed to the Federal Court earlier than I would otherwise have been because I was female. I may well have been appointed, but I don't think I would have been appointed when I was. The government was quite deliberately looking for women who could be appointed to superior courts. Now, some people said to me, against that, the honourable thing would have been to say no. I didn't think so. I agreed with them. There was a serious public need for women in the superior judiciary, and I thought there was some real good in my doing it. I think that hopefully the balance will change. Whether it has yet's an issue of opinion. There's now a serious need to have leading women at the bar, to have leading women in the firms. We need role models all around. But I know that it is often said women ought not to accept what might be an easier path, and I think you have to examine the circumstances of the particular case. And if women are saying, look, I don't want help because I've got childcare responsibilities, or I don't want help even though my mother is dying, I just tell them to get over it. It's another little story, but it tells you something. The entire time I sat on the Federal Court, I did not have a single woman say to me, if I said, is it convenient to sit later than the usual court hours, say, actually, no, it wouldn't suit me. Men used to leap to their feet and beam at me and say, Your Honour, I have to pick my kids up from school. And they knew that I just sort of melted at the wonderful feminist approach they were bringing and how wonderful the fathers I thought they were. But the women wouldn't ask for it. And we eventually, I hope it's a practice that's continued, if we ever were going to change the sitting hours, we announced that we were going to deal with that issue in 10 minutes' time and adjourn the court. People could make calls, come back, and then say, is anyone inconvenienced? So no one had to say why it was, because only men will claim to be picking up kids, looking after sick parents, all of them. The women will pretend they're not, because they feel it undermines their legitimacy. The danger is, in some people's eyes, it does, and we have to learn for it not to.
Last Friday, I attended Adelaide to the swearing out ceremony of Justice Mansfield, where you were present. And I turned up there and I was sat at the bar table. There were about 20 people at the bar table. And I don't know if you recall this, but I was the only woman at the bar table. And I had that horrible feeling that I don't think I'd ever had in Sydney, because there's a critical mass here in Sydney of about 20% or so of women at the bar, that I was the only gay in the village. And I looked up at the bench and there were 11 judges and 2 of them were women. One, I'm pleased to say, is an Adelaide appointee recently, but there has not been a woman appointee in Adelaide since yourself. And then I started to think about there are no women judges in Perth. I have a national practice, and I see a lot of female judges in Sydney and Melbourne, but in these less larger capital cities, there are always men, and there are always men at the bar table, and I felt very lonely and very depressed by that experience. And it must be an experience you've had a lot when you were at the bar. And I wonder if there's anything that can be done about that for women to feel more included when there aren't numbers there, and that everyone on the bench also seems to be a man as well. Do you have any views on that? Because you were sitting there as well.
Yes, but in the back row, because
Yes, you weren't current.
South Australia has a charming habit of asking its retired judges to sit for ceremonial occasions behind the robe judges. So that's why I was there, and I was pleased to, of course, and very pleased to honour Justice Mansfield.
Well, there are a small number of judges in Adelaide, so there's now one woman and 2 or 3 men. The others were all the senior judges from interstate.
So it's certainly the case that now that Justice Bennett has retired here, I think the senior puny judges in every state are male. The numbers, nonetheless, across the whole court are not high. I think the time when there was a very active search for women maybe has passed to some degree, although I know when Natalie Talsworth was appointed recently, there was great excitement at her appointment. First for her personal skills, but second because it brought a female judge back to the federal court in Adelaide. Look, it's a shame. I think some governments of some persuasions are more sympathetic to trying to look perhaps for the less likely but nonetheless highly qualified appointment than others. I can't say much more than that, I don't think.
I mean, just if I can add, it's a very big challenge that law firms face in a different way than the one that you've identified. Clearly there are a number of more women in partnership roles, but we announced some targets back in 2014 that we would aim to achieve by the 1st of May next year, the 25% of our female partners as female, and then by 1 May 2017 that would be up at 30%. And there's quite a bit of research that suggests when one gets to that sort of level that the momentum is so real that you don't have to continue to identify consciously or unconsciously particular candidates for roles. Now, I'm proud to say that within the disputes group here in Australia we will achieve that goal by next year. I'm not sure ultimately whether the firm will, globally, we've obviously got offices all around the world, and it continues to be a big challenge for us. But one of the things that it has done is change the dialogue in very many of our discussions around talent, around remuneration, etc., to be looking at a very early stage about the performance of female and male lawyers, and to be trying to observe differences that might be emerging, and if there are rational reasons for that beyond unconscious bias, for example. So it continues to be obviously a huge challenge that we face, and we recognise both the bar and the judiciary's challenge obviously is an integral part of that community.
If I could just add, Luke is of course right. He didn't put it quite this way, but I think it's what he's saying. If you want change at the top, you've got to start it at the bottom. That's why I think what's happening to women in the first years after they leave law school is so critical.
Thank you very much for your rapt attention. Kathy, I'm not the least surprised to know, or to observe as you can, that it's standing room only today. We were very, very pleased when Leah contacted you some weeks back to ask whether you would be willing to come along to this event, that you were so willing to come and share with us your perspectives. The wisdom and insights are incredibly powerful. I'm sure that everybody here has taken away from those observations the same as I have, a degree of discomfort, concern, and obviously need for focus on these issues, on equality and on justice. Could you all please join with me in thanking the Honourable Cathy Branson.
It's a great pleasure to be here.
Cathy, we have a small token of our appreciation. You can open that later. There are a few other...
Lovely bag, yes.
There are a few other people that I just briefly wanted to thank. Leah, who I mentioned a moment ago, Leah Monk and Bianca Burke, two of our lawyers in our women's network. This event was their brainchild, and very, very pleased to see it have been achieved in such an impressive way today. Danielle Kelly, who sits down in the front row here, together with Georgina Brown, head up our Diversity and Inclusion Committee here at Herbert Smith Freehills. Very, very important that they are very vibrant committees and that we have the leadership and advice that comes from Danielle and Georgina. And then finally, Heidi Oldfield and Laura Christo, who have behind the scenes made this event what it is. So if you could join with me in thanking them.